Hey everyone, it's Roy. I appreciate you guys checking this video out. Now, I'm more of a guitar player, so over the years, I really wanted to learn how to do my own basic amp maintenance. Now, what this video is not going to do is go into NASA science level deep schematics and every nuance of the inner workings of a tube amp. There are amazing videos on YouTube, especially some of these old dudes who've been working on like radios and tube amps for like 100 years, and they know every detail of and everything about these amps. That's not what this video is for. If you want that level of information, go to one of those channels, and trust me, those guys really know what they're doing. What this video is going to be for, and who it's going to be for, is that guitar player who has a tube amp. You want to learn how to do your own amp, tube swaps, biasing, socket cleaning, some basic once-over troubleshooting, things like that, so that you can save some money and you don't have to be without your amp when you send it into an amp tech for the simplest thing like swapping out your power tubes. So many years ago, every time I wanted to swap out power tubes, or I had a blown set of tubes or something like that, I'd have to send it into my amp tech guy. This dude was in a band, so anytime I would send my amp in, I knew I was going to be without it from a week to 10 days, all the way up to 4 to 6 weeks, and it was never going to be without spending about $175 to $375, depending on what was going on with the amp. And I started thinking there has to be a way I can do some of this myself, but I was nervous about getting shocked. Everybody talks about how scary it is to mess with the voltages inside these amps. Once I learned these basic procedures myself, not only did I save hundreds and even thousands of dollars over years, but I'm no longer afraid of these things. I know what to look for. I know how to discharge them if I need to. And most importantly, I can swap power tubes whenever I feel like it because I know how to bias this amp. So, one disclaimer. Of course, be careful working around these things, especially if you have power running to it. These things, the DC voltage inside the capacitors can screw your weekend up if you grab onto them in the wrong way.
1, 2, 3, 4.
That part is true. And also remember, although it's cool to learn some techniques yourself and learn how to do some of the, this stuff DIY style, anything you feel that's above your capabilities or you just don't feel comfortable doing, don't damage your amp. Send it into a qualified tech. That's why those guys are out there. So let's get into it. After that disclaimer, I think we're about ready to go. I want to start with some tools that I think would be beneficial for you guys to have on hand, especially if you think you're going to continue doing your own biasing and doing your own amp cleaning for some time to come. These are some things that I think would make your life a lot easier. Now, if you are an actual amp tech, you're going to have probably hundreds and thousands of different tools that you use to maintain people's amps. But if you're a guitar player and you want to just do some basic things with your amp to keep it running smoothly, these are the things that I think you should have laying around to make the job a lot easier. Let's start with number one and my favorite, Deoxit 5. Deoxit 5 is an electrical contact cleaner and lubricant, and this stuff is amazing. It's not cheap, but I always recommend having this stuff on hand. It's great for cleaning all electronic circuits, and it's really great, especially for female XLR sockets and power tube sockets. So get some Deoxit 5. You can get it off of Amazon, StuMac. A ton of places sell it, and it's fantastic. All right, the next thing I want to recommend is chopsticks, and I mean the wooden, cheap carry-out chopsticks. I know that sounds a little funny, but they actually make what's called electronics inspection sticks, which are about 25 bucks a pack, and what they are fancy-looking chopsticks. The next time you order some carry-out, get a couple extra pair of those cheap wooden chopsticks. You never want to stick a metal object into your amp unless you are a qualified tech that knows it's safe to do that. But working around high voltage, DC voltage like this, and then sticking a metal conductor in your hand inside that amp can be a bad idea. I use wooden chopsticks all the time. I use it to poke around and to inspect things, and you don't have to run the risk of getting shocked by having that in your hand. Keep those on hand and do not spend money on any type of weird inspection sticks. All right, the next thing I want to mention is something called a voltage snuffer stick. Now you can make these yourselves. There's plenty of YouTube videos out there about how people make these. They're probably very simple to make, but I bought mine from StewMac, and I'll put a link exactly to the item that I have. But all it really is, it's a wooden stick that has a resistor inside. It's got a metal tip, and then it has a lead coming off of it with a little alligator clip. The whole point of this is you clip it onto the chassis of your amp to ground it, and then you can quickly discharge those the DC voltage in your capacitors until that amp is safe to touch. It's a great little tool. If you buy it, you know it's made the right way and it's gonna do things the right way, and it's a very safe way to discharge your amp. Okay, the next thing you guys need to have, and this is just essential. I think every dude should own one of these for even household projects, a good digital multimeter. Now, does it have to be like a $250 fluke meter? Not unless you're an electrician, you don't need anything of that level. I have a couple that I really like. I have an old Radio Shack digital multimeter that I bought. I think I paid around $100 for it. Thing still works amazing to this day. But my other favorite one is called, I think it's called an Astro AI. I got it off of Amazon, and I love this multimeter. It's got a ton of good, useful settings on it. It even has a magnetic strap on the back so you can flip it over a metal pole and have it hang freely so you can see it easier if you're working on something and there's, metal around. But this thing is affordable and it's very accurate. My uncle has about every fluke meter you can think of, and we put it up against his fluke meters and it held its own. I highly recommend these, but having a good multimeter on hand is necessary for biasing your own amp, and it's great to have for anytime you need a multimeter. So I recommend having two multimeters because in some cases, you can use them at the same time like I do to do your plate voltage and to run your milliamps when you're biasing. And it's nice to be able to do, that job at the same time, but one multimeter will suffice. Some people like analog multimeters, like old school Harbor Freight ones, things like that. I don't really like analog multimeters, but some people swear by them. It's all personal preference, but get a good digital multimeter. It will last you a long time and you could use it for a gazillion different projects. Okay, the next thing I recommend you guys get, especially if you're going to continue to do maintenance on your amp for any time to come, is what's called a bias probe. Now, when it comes to biasing your power tubes, there's a few different methods that can work. One method is called a transformer shunt method. I'm not going to go into all the details of these because I want to keep this a little bit shorter, but of all the different methods out there, my favorite is simply using a bias probe. It's fast, it's safe, it's easy, and they're not that expensive depending on what model you get. Now, what is a bias probe? It's basically just a little power tube socket that has a lead on it that goes to your multimeter to allow you to read in milliamps quite quickly the value of that tube and how that tube is, where that tube is reading in your amp. And it's just an easy way to read bias. Now, you can get one with a single socket. You can get one that has two sockets on it. You can even get it where there's four leads, 4 sockets going to your multimeter. I don't think you need one of those really expensive ones. I bought a really expensive one once that had plate voltage it would read, and then you could read in milliamps below that all at the same time by plugging just one tube into it, and it broke 3 weeks later and stopped giving me the milliamp reading, and it really kind of pissed me off because it was like $300. My favorite one is the one I'm about to show you now. I got it from a company that sells them on Reverb. There's a little switch so you can flip back and forth. If you have 4 power tubes in your amp, it allows you to quickly, flip between one set and another set. And it's very reliable and very accurate. So I definitely recommend getting one of these. And I definitely recommend using a bias probe to bias your power tubes. To me, it's the simplest method. The next thing I recommend is an inexpensive or a decent set of electrician screwdrivers, especially the micro screwdrivers. I have 2 sets of these. I have a micro set and a standard set for larger screws. And basically what an electrician screwdriver is, they're rated for working around voltage. It's a metal tip, it's a plastic shaft, and usually a plastic and rubber handle or an all rubber handle, but it keeps you from having an all metal object in your hand when you're biasing the amp and you're probing around. You don't want to have a metal screwdriver in your hand, not just because you can get shocked, but also because you can short things out if you were to lay a metal screwdriver across something incorrectly. I used to have this really nice Ampeg SVT amp a long time ago, and I had a metal screwdriver in my hand, and I accidentally dropped it when I was moving the amp around. It was in my mouth, believe it or not, like an idiot. It fell out of my mouth. It landed inside the amp when the amp was on because I was doing some readings, and it shorted the whole thing out and blew that amp. And I said, I am never going to use a metal screwdriver again. But these are really handy. You can get them anywhere. They don't have to be expensive. The micro set is what I use the most, but having electrician screwdrivers is just a much safer way to work around voltage. All right, the next thing I want to recommend is one of my favorite tools for cleaning just about anything in my studio and in my little shop here, and it's what's called Dill's pipe cleaners. You'll hear a lot of people recommend these. They're meant for cleaning pipes, obviously, but it's these little flexible sticks that you can bend and fold, and they have like Q-tippy felt on them, and they fit absolutely perfectly into female XLR sockets, but they also fit perfectly into power tube sockets. And it's a great way to clean things out. I had these recommended to me, and I went and bought a whole bunch of packs of these, and I use them all the time. They're inexpensive and they work great. Another thing, if you guys have amps, it doesn't just have to be a tube amp, but I really like this like amp and case cleaner lotion from a company called Music Nomad. This stuff is awesome. And I don't know what your amps look like, but I'm not a gigging musician. I'm only a hobbyist, but I like the Tolex on my amps to look really nice for as long as possible. Now, some of you like that road-worn look where you got like rings from putting beer bottles and cigarette burns and all that. And God bless you, whatever your thing is, man, rock it. But for me, I like to keep my amps as nice looking as I can for as long as possible. These things cost a fortune, and basically they look badass, especially when they're nice and clean. They retain their value. This stuff really conditions and really puts a nice shine on the Tolex of your amp, regardless of what type of amp you have. It's like I said, it's from Music Nomad. It's pretty cheap and it does a great job. The next thing I recommend you guys get, if you don't already have it, and most of you probably already do, is a little set of sockets that's dedicated towards working on your guitars and amps. Especially if you're like a gigging musician, to be able to throw like a little small socket set, something that you know fits all of the jacks, fits the nuts on the guitar pots, things like that. I have a little one that I use for my guitar that has the major sizes already on it. You can just flip it to whatever one fits. It's just handy to have, and you will definitely need it when you're doing maintenance on your amp. Now, if you're new to amps in general, when this part here is called the chassis, and this can be pulled outside of your amp to work on it or bias it or change the tubes. Now, for most of the stuff that I'm going to show you guys with the maintenance, you may not have to pull the chassis out of the amp to get access to anything that we're about to do. I still like to pull mine because it gives me a better overall view. But the problem is you need a place to set that chassis to comfortably work on it and make sure that it doesn't run the risk of falling over, which can bust your tubes, break the amp. And if you're biasing it and you have power to it, having that thing be not sturdy, you do not want to all of a sudden reach and grab it because it's falling and get shocked, of course. That's very, very unsafe. So I built mine because I didn't really find any that I liked. I did it with some cheap excess wood I had laying around. I used some 2x4s and I think some 5/8 plywood. And then I threw a coat of stain on it. I did some drilling to put some compartments here that can put the power and preamp tubes and then some little parts in here. And this thing works awesome. I even put some holes in here so that I can angle the chassis at 3 different angles. If anybody's interested in what this looks like, in a little more detail and how I built it, I'd be happy to send you all the detail. I think they should sell one just like the one I built here. This part here slides in and out to accommodate different size amp chassis, and I have been using this one for maybe 8 years now, and I absolutely love it. It's just a great and safe way to be able to have the tubes hanging so that they're not leaning or touching anything, especially when they're hot. I can put my load box under here. I can put an inspection light under there. So have a good place to be able to do the maintenance and work on your amp that's safe, and you don't run the risk of that thing falling over and damaging everything. All right, the amp I'm using as an example when you see me doing the maintenance here, it's my reissue Marshall 1959 SLP 100 watt Plexi. It is one of my all-time favorite amps. And the first thing we're gonna do is make sure there's no power running to the amp, okay? If you've played it recently, let it cool down so that those power tubes are nice and cool. You're gonna disconnect the power and any cables running to that amp so that we can get ready to pull all the tubes. We're going to remove the power and preamp tubes. We're just going to give them a little wiggle. Don't put too much side-to-side pressure on the tubes. Give them a little wiggle until they pop out, and then place them somewhere where they do not run the risk of rolling off the table, because that will probably upset you also if you break tubes. If you have the type of power tubes that have the little metal retainer near the tube socket, like this Fender Twin here, you're just going to slide your fingers around the edges of that tube retainer. You're going to push it down and then gently wiggle your tubes out. Remove all the power tubes at this point. When you get to the preamp tubes, you're going to remove them the same way. Now, if you have metal tube casings over top of the preamp tubes, you're just going to, in most cases, press it down, twist it, and then that casing will pop off to access the preamp tube underneath of it. Give those tubes a little wiggle and pop those out as well. Be careful, the pins on the bottom of a preamp tube, like a 12AX7, you know, they're pretty small little pins. Don't be too forceful with these things. Just give them a wiggle, pop them out, and lay all your tubes aside for now. Okay, now we're going to get out to Deoxit 5 and our Dills pipe cleaners. If you don't have the pipe cleaners at this point, it's okay. There's another way to do the same exact thing that I'll show you also. What we're going to do is, if you look at the top of the can of Deoxit 5, you'll notice by the little spray nozzle that you can go from less spray to more spray simply by twisting the nozzle itself. You want it on the lowest spray setting, and you want the little aiming stick inside the nozzle too, so that we can pinpoint spray this directly into the socket holes. Now what we're going to do is, I like to start with the power tubes. We're going to spray a little bit into each socket hole, take the Dills pipe cleaner, work it in and out until we've cleaned each of the power tube sockets. Now if you don't have the little pipe cleaners, that's okay. I keep a power tube and a preamp tube, an old of each, sitting here in my shop. And what I'll do is I'll spray the pins on the power tube, work it in and out of the tube socket, and then wipe the pins off with a napkin and move on to the next power tube socket. If you don't have an extra tube, just use one of the power tubes you have. Just be very careful when you're working it in and out of the socket that, again, you do it carefully. You don't want to damage the socket or break the pins on the tube. Make sure you don't misthread it. The 12AX7 tubes are a lot easier to misplace into the tube socket than the power tubes, because the power tubes have that plastic key on the center post, so it's pretty hard not to put it in place. But clean all the power tube sockets one way or the other, and then we're going to move on to the preamp tubes. Now, unfortunately, the little Dills pipe cleaners, they're not going to fit into these tube sockets. So I'm going to take my old 12AX7 tube, I'm going to spray the pins of it carefully, and then I'm going to work it in and out of the socket, just like I recommended for the power tubes, wipe the pins off with a napkin, and move on to the next preamp tube socket. So at this point, we're going to work our way all the way through, whether you have one preamp tube or 6, it doesn't matter. Clean them all using this method and the Deoxit 5 until you have all the power tube and preamp tube sockets complete. Now, there's some other things we're going to clean, so you can still leave all the tubes out of your amp at this point, but we have all the sockets completed. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the potentiometers or pots, and we're going to move into any of the 1/4-inch jacks that are on the amp, okay? I like to work out to in, so I'm gonna take the Dill's pipe cleaners and I'm gonna crack them in half. I'm gonna spray some Deoxit 5 on them, and I'm gonna start working it in and out of the input jack. I'm going to work it out in and out of the speaker jacks, the effects loop, anywhere where you have an input jack on that guitar, we're going to work a pipe cleaner in and out of there to make sure that each of those sockets are clean. Now, one of the best things that Deoxit 5 can be used for is cleaning potentiometers. So any pot that you can get access to, we're just going to spray a little bit of Deoxit 5 into it and then turn that pot back and forth to let it penetrate down into where the wiper is. And we're going to do every single pot we can get access to, including our little bias pot, everything. This is a great way to keep all the pots on your amp or your guitar, by the way, to keep them all running nicely, keep them crackle-free, noise-free. It's just a really great preventative maintenance. Okay, this next step, it's not 100% necessary, especially if you know the amp is working perfectly fine, but it's something I like to do, especially if I have the chassis pulled out of the amp, like you see the Marshall I'm showing you guys. So I'm going to take a wooden chopstick, even though I know there's no voltage going to this amp, and this amp is 100% safe to stick my hands into, I'm going to use a wooden chopstick, and I'm basically going to inspect the wires overall to make sure I don't see any push connectors that might be loose and starting to come off, any wires that may be coming loose from a solder joint, just anything that may be obvious, okay? It's okay if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. No one's asking you to understand all the wiring here, but what you are looking for is when you move wires near where they're connected, does something look like it's about to pop off? Does it look loose? You know, if the amp is working fine, everything is probably connected okay. But there have been situations where I've had push connectors that were right on the edge of coming off that have worked themselves looser over time from moving the amp around, and it could have failed in the middle of playing it, especially you gigging musicians out there. This is just a great once-over to check and make sure there's nothing absolutely obvious that's about to happen with the wires. Once I'm done this, and usually I just do it for a minute or so, we can move on to the next step. Before we can go in and bias the amp, there's some things that we're going to have to do. We're going to want to get the power cord plugged back up to the amp. And we're also going to absolutely make sure that we have a speaker load attached to the amp. Now, a speaker load is either going to be plugging, you know, your speaker cabinet back in. If it's a combo amp, make sure the internal speaker is plugged back in. And if you have the chassis completely pulled and your speaker cabinet is not even in the same room, like the situation I'm showing you here in my video, I like to use what's called a load box. I have a 16 ohm and an 8 ohm load box. I'm going to take one of these load boxes, in this case the 16 ohm load box, and I'm going to plug it into my speaker output jack so that the amp thinks there's a speaker attached. If you do not hook a speaker load up to a tube amp, you will damage it. Make sure you never power a tube amp up without a speaker load attached. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put all the tubes back into the amp. That amp cannot be fired up until those tubes are back into it. So we're going to carefully push all the power tubes back in, all the 12AX7 tubes back in. Now, know if your preamp tubes have those little metal casings on them, you do not need those to be back on just to fire the amp up. Also, if you have spring retainers on your power tubes, like this Marshall does, you don't even have to put those back on at this point. But we do want all the tubes back into the amp. We have power running to it. We have a speaker load attached to it, and we're ready to go. We're going to turn our multimeter on, and we are going to set it to DC voltage. We're going to take the black lead and ground it to the chassis. I like to just push it through this metal hole here, which I absolutely know is ground here on this amp. And once this amp is fired up, we are going to go to the first power tube, and we're going to touch the red lead to pin 3. This is going to give us our plate voltage. Okay, now that we have the pin voltage, we're going to power the amp back down. Now, at this point, the power tubes could have already gotten quite hot, so I'm just going to tap them and check them, and we're going to end up pulling one tube so that we can take our bias probe, plug the tube into that bias probe, and then back into the socket. The leads are going to go to my other multimeter. Now, if you only have one multimeter, just use it now for this. So you're going to plug your bias probe into your multimeter, but now we're going to set the multimeter to milliamps. So before we actually turn the amp back on and we bias the amp checking the milliamps, we need to know one more piece of data to fill into our bias formula. So we already have the plate voltage, but now what we need to know is the wattage of the tubes that we're working with, okay? And I'm just trying to keep this really, really simple. Now, this Marshall here can take EL34s, but it can also take KT77s like you see me using here in this particular plexi. Those two tube types are interchangeable. KT77s and EL34s, you can use 25 watts as that bias formula number. If you have 6L6s, or you have 5881s, like in my JCM 900, you're going to use 30 watts in general for those. If you're unsure what the wattage of your tubes are, just look it up. It'll only take a minute to find. So now that we have the plate voltage and we know the tube wattage, we're going to use what's called a certain dissipation number. Now this is basically how hot we're going to be running these tubes. And again, I'm keeping this very simple and unscientific, but it'll get the point across and make it easy for you guys. Most people run their tubes at what's called 70% dissipation, but you can go up to about 85%, meaning hotter you can push those tubes. Remember though, if you're not at least 70% dissipation, the power tubes aren't really getting enough voltage to really make that amp sound great. Some people like their tubes to run really hot, but the problem with that is that it can wear the tubes out a lot faster, and you're constantly going to be buying power tubes in some cases. I've seen people bias their amps all the way up to around 90% dissipation, okay? But the bias formula that we're going to use is the tube wattage that we discussed, divided by the plate voltage, times either 0.70 or all the way up to 85% dissipation, which would be, say, 0.80, 0.85. In my case, we're just going to do it at 70% dissipation, which is the number in most cases I recommend. Now, you will hear some people say, I like to bias my amp by ear. I don't recommend doing this because you could be way off and have those tubes screaming hot. And like I said, it might sound good to you, but those power tubes are going to cook fast, okay? So we're just going to use 70% dissipation. We're going to do 25 divided by the plate voltage times 0.70, and that's going to give us 39 milliamps. This is what we're going to be looking for when we set the little bias pot on this amp. We're going to be trying to hit that number on our multimeter in milliamps. Okay, so one more time, remember that formula. You're going to take the tube wattage, divide it by the plate voltage, and then we're going to times it anywhere between 0.70 and 0.85. But like I said, I like to try 0.70 first. So we have the multimeter turned on, and we have it set to milliamps. We have our bias probe plugged in, and now we're going to see where it comes in. If it's not at 39, we're going to gently turn the bias pot until it hits the number we're looking for. Okay, now people have asked me with some of my other bias videos, how come my tubes are reading differently? Well, that's why you want to get what's called a matched set of tubes. Now, my favorite place to buy power tubes and tubes in general is a place called the Tube Store. I really, really like the tube selections that they have, and they also give you great recommendations based on the type of amp you have as to what tubes they think would work well in your amp based on what they have in stock. They also usually give 3 levels of recommendations, from sort of value tubes all the way up through tubes that I don't know if anybody should be able to afford. This Marshall that you see that I'm working on here, guys, their ultimate package, I think it's like $700 for the tubes for this thing. I'm not a tube snob, but I do believe in using good tubes. And you want your power tubes to be matched as closely as possible so that they're not all running at different voltages. Now, some amps, like the JCM 2000, you're going to set the bias by doing pairs of tubes, and that is a balancing act that is always so much fun to do. It's kind of a pain, actually, but this particular amp here, there's one bias pot. We're going to just put this on one tube, and I know that this is a good match squad of tubes, and if you buy them from a reputable dealer, they will usually have a matching service for you. Now, the last thing I recommend doing is let that amp run for maybe another 5 to 10 minutes, and then I like to check the bias one more time just to make sure that it didn't drift and that it is locked in at the 39 that I'm going to be shooting for here. And that's it. This amp is biased and ready to go. Now, I set this amp a long time ago at 39, okay? And you can see it had drifted a touch over the last year and a half, and I had to reset it here. So that's why I think it's important to check the bias on your power tubes when you're doing your overall, say, yearly maintenance on a fully functioning amp, just to make sure that it hasn't drifted. We didn't have to discharge this amp because we didn't have to touch inside with our hands to do any of the things that we just did. So we didn't really have to discharge it, but if you guys need to do something further than what I've shown you here, and you need to make sure that that amp is safe to touch, this is what you're going to look for. So do know that most of the dangerous voltage that's going to come out of this amp, and what people are talking about shocking you, is coming from the capacitors. On this Marshall here, you're going to see it's these blue kind of tower things here. Do know you can touch the tops, the blue part of those capacitors with your hands. Some people have so little knowledge about amps that they're like, if you even touch the blue part, you'll get shocked. That is not true. When you are grabbing the chassis to remove it from the enclosure or put it back in, never grab onto the tubes to do it. Never grab onto the capacitors. You're going to hold onto the large transformers to get that amp back inside or removed from the enclosure. Don't wrap your fingers around here either when you're pulling the amp out. Now, this amp is completely discharged because I'm working on the tube sockets right now. If you take your multimeter and you ground it with the black lead and you put it on DC voltage and you go into the guts of the amp, you're going to look for the positive leads of those capacitors, and you're going to check to see in voltage what's happening with them. And you can see right away, in some cases you can get 300-400 volts coming through there. You're going to take your snuffer stick and you're going to ground it to the chassis, hold it against those legs, and you're going to drain those capacitor values down. There's another video here on my channel of how to discharge your combo amp quickly, and I'm showing you basically the same method with a snuffer stick, how I drain the voltage quickly, and then you're going to check on your multimeter to make sure that voltage is low enough to stick your hands inside the amp. Check all of the capacitors, and I like to even go through and check all the tube sockets just to make sure there's no like renegade voltage running through here. Now, on a Fender amp like this one here, I can't see the capacitors except for this one right here. And this one is 500 volts, this guy right here. So I can get access to this one. But what you need to know is that on some amps, you have a little pan where you're going to have to undo the pan to get access to the main capacitors that are storing that dangerous voltage to make sure that those are drained as well. Now, also know that if you hold the red lead against the positive capacitor leg, as long as that multimeter is grounded, it'll also start to drain the voltage out of it. But I like using that snuffer stick also at the same time and checking the voltage as I'm doing it until I see that voltage drop to a level that I know is safe. Check all the capacitors, make sure there's no power cords attached to the amp, and that amp will become safe to touch. And that's it. It's that easy, guys. A funny old video that I saw was Stevie Ray Vaughan's tech quickly discharging a tube amp with a screwdriver by shorting it across the capacitor legs. And you heard this big zap, and he's like, that's how you do it quickly. I mean, he's Stevie Ray Vaughan's tech, so I guess he knew what the hell he was doing. But in my opinion, that looked so ridiculously unsafe. I don't think I would ever do that. And that big zapping sound cannot be good for the amp. So don't do that, okay? All right, guys, so that's how I do basic maintenance on an amp. Remember, it's my way of doing things. Be kind. People on YouTube can be a little much at times, but we're just trying to put some good info out there that is safe and reliable so you guys can keep your amps running. And remember, there's channels where they go very in-depth on tube amps if you guys want to check those out and you need even, more deep information. This is just for a guitar player that wants to know how to do some basic stuff. So you guys have any questions, let me know. I'm always happy to help, and I appreciate you sticking out through this video. And if you haven't subscribed, maybe subscribe if you want to. I don't get a chance to make a lot of videos. I'm actually a professional full-time photographer, so I don't get a lot of chance to do this sort of thing, which is actually my favorite thing to do, is playing guitar, working on amps, preamps, microphones, things like that, and recording. So I love doing this stuff, and I'm always here to help and help you guys with anything you're involved in. So let me know, and thanks a lot for stopping by.